amid the windswept hills of the California coast, where the ocean stretches all the way to the horizon and the sky seems never to close in. There stands a structure that feels as though it does not belong to this world. A magnificent castle rises atop a hill, gazing down at the deep blue sea, at once reminiscent of a European fairy tale dream and evocative of a lavish mirage in the American West. This is Hearst Castle. From the very first moment, the place overwhelms, not only because of its immense scale, its marble, bell towers, pools, and opulent rooms, but because of the quiet question it provokes. Why would one person need a structure like this? And what within that person compelled him to build it, unceasingly, without limits, for nearly 3 decades? Hearst Castle is not merely a residence. It is a declaration, a mark of power, wealth, and an ambition that seems to know no end. Every stone, every statue, every endless corridor carries a message that the man behind it did not simply wish to possess beauty, but to transcend time, to immortalize his name amid this vast landscape. Yet it is precisely here, within this breathtaking scenery, that a sense of unease begins to seep in. For excessive beauty often comes with an invisible cost. Behind the lavish parties, the famous guests, and the glittering lights lies the obsession of a man who always wanted more power, more recognition, and more control over the world around him. This castle did not rise overnight. It is the result of thousands of decisions, millions of dollars, and countless years of fixation. It was built not merely to be lived in, but to prove something. To prove that its owner could transport old Europe onto young American soil, that he could challenge the limits of architecture, finance, and human ambition itself. Standing before Hearst Castle, one is easily swept up in admiration. But if one listens more closely, the place whispers another story, a story of loneliness at the summit, of a fear of being forgotten, and of a man who believed that only through stone, gold, and grandeur could he fill the emptiness within himself. This opening is not merely an introduction to an architectural monument. It is a doorway into the mind of William Randolph Hearst, a man whose ambition was great enough to create beauty, yet also great enough to sow the seeds of his own tragedy. From this moment on, the story is no longer just about a castle, but about the price of wanting to possess the entire world. Before Hearst Castle became a symbol of boundless ambition, before the name Hearst became synonymous with a media power capable of shaking the entire United States, there was a boy who grew up in circumstances most Americans of that era could only dream of. William Randolph Hearst was not born into scarcity, but into abundance, expectation, and the legacy already mapped out long before he was old enough to understand who he was. His father, George Hearst, was a successful mining magnate who amassed a vast fortune from silver, gold, and land during America's westward expansion. His mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, was an educated, refined woman with formidable social ambitions. She was not only wealthy, but deeply convinced that her son was destined for greatness, far beyond the confines of an ordinary businessman's life. William Randolph Hearst's childhood was wrapped in careful attention, European travels, art collections, and an almost unquestioned belief that he was exceptional. From an early age, Hearst grew accustomed to being heard, accommodated, and encouraged to dream beyond conventional limits. Yet this privilege quietly created a distance between him and the world of ordinary people, those who had to accept limits and compromise with reality. When sent to elite schools and later to Harvard, Hearst was far from a model student. He became known for his recklessness, his defiance of rules, and his insistence on doing things his own way. His expulsion from Harvard was not a failure in the traditional sense. but an early signal of an ego unwilling to be controlled, a man who believed that rules existed to be bent, provided one had enough power and confidence. It was during this period that the seeds of an enormous ego began to take root. Hearst did not merely want to succeed like his father. He wanted to surpass him, to leave a mark that could not be ignored. He refused to live in the shadow of his family legacy, yet simultaneously relied entirely on the resources that legacy provided. This deep contradiction both fueled his ambition and fostered a quiet, persistent insecurity. The relationship between Hearst and his mother was especially significant. Phoebe Hearst not only financed her son's early ventures, but reinforced the belief that he deserved more. Her nearly unconditional support gave Hearst the freedom to pursue bold ideas, but also blurred the line between desire and necessity, between creative ambition and an obsession with control. To understand Hearst Castle, one must understand the man who created it, a man raised in excess, taught that limits were for others, and that fame and power were the ultimate measures of worth. This section does not seek to judge William Randolph Hearst, but to place him within his proper context, a product of the Gilded Age, of explosive wealth, and of the belief that money could turn any dream into reality. From this foundation, Hearst's ego gradually expanded, not merely as arrogance, but as a driving force pushing him to dominate every field he entered. And when media power entered his life, that ambition would no longer remain personal, but begin to shape American society itself. At the end of the 19th century, the United States entered a period later known as the Gilded Age. It was an era of explosive growth, railroads stretching across the continent, factories rising, cities swelling, and wealth accumulating at an unprecedented pace. Yet that glittering gold covered only the surface. Beneath it lay deep inequality, exhausted labor, and power concentrated in the hands of a small group who knew how to control money and information. In that context, journalism was not merely a means of communication. It became a weapon. Whoever controlled the press could shape truth, create enemies, inflame emotions, and steer the masses at will. For a society searching for identity and direction, newspapers were the mirror America looked into each morning. And mirrors can reflect, but they can also distort. William Randolph Hearst entered this world with a sharp instinct for the power of words and images. When he took over his first newspapers, America was ready for a new kind of journalism, louder, more emotional, and less constrained by caution. News was no longer just about informing. It was about provoking, entertaining, and capturing attention in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The Gilded Age was the age of tycoons. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan controlled steel, oil, and finance. Hearst chose a different path, but one no less powerful. He controlled the narrative. Through his newspapers, he could elevate a figure into a hero or cast a rival as a villain. Truth became a flexible material, shaped to serve a larger purpose. Hearst's journalism perfectly reflected the spirit of the era, fast, forceful, and unforgiving. Bold headlines, shocking images, and stories crafted to strike directly at human instincts: fear, anger, pride, and desire. In a society where many felt left behind, this style of journalism offered a sense of being heard, even if the cost was the oversimplification and polarization of reality. That power expanded with every issue sold. Hearst did not simply grow richer. He became influential. Politicians took notice. The public trusted him. And gradually, the boundary between information and manipulation blurred. When journalism could push nations toward war, destroy reputations, and steer public opinion, questions of ethical responsibility became more urgent than ever. But in the Gilded Age, such questions were rarely asked with real force. Society celebrated success, regardless of the means. If someone was clever enough to manipulate the system, they were seen as a victor. Hearst was no exception. He was a quintessential product of his time, an era that believed power itself was proof of legitimacy. It was within this broad historical landscape that Hearst's personal ambition found fertile ground. Journalism became an empire, one that fed his ego, financed ever larger dreams, and fostered the illusion that no boundary was beyond reach. And when media power combined with inherited wealth, a symbolic project was born, not merely a place to live, but a monument meant to display dominance, assert identity, and carve a name into nature and history itself. On the windswept hills of San Simeon, where the Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly and morning fog blurs the horizon, there once existed nothing more than a modest ranch for pigs and cattle. It was a rugged, isolated landscape, far removed from urban life, where the Hearst family would retreat during hunting trips. To many, San Simeon was merely a stop along the way. But to William Randolph Hearst, it gradually became an idea and then an obsession. Hearst did not dream of a house in the conventional sense. He envisioned a structure that could transcend time, something grand enough to reflect his power, his aesthetic sensibility, and his personal imprint upon American history. In his mind, San Simeon was not simply land. It was a stage, and he was the director of a monumental production in which architecture, art, and nature merged into one. In 1919, Hearst began turning that vision into reality. He modestly called his project La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. But behind the romantic name lay an ambition of immense scale. Hearst sought to build not just a castle, but an entire architectural complex infused with the spirit of old Europe, standing defiantly in the young, pragmatic American West. To realize this vision, he turned to Julia Morgan, one of the rare and most gifted female architects of her time. The relationship between Hearst and Morgan was both a creative collaboration and a severe test of endurance. Hearst possessed sweeping vision, but was also obsessively meticulous, constantly revising ideas and refusing compromise. Morgan, with her iron discipline and exceptional technical skill, became the only person capable of giving physical form to ideas that often seemed impossible. Every wall, every arch, every decorative detail was built not only from concrete and stone, but from an obsession with perfection. Hearst imported thousands of works of art, Spanish wooden ceilings, Italian stone sculptures, European tapestries, and antiques. Gradually, Hearst Castle became a living museum, where the history of an entire continent was reconstructed on California soil. Yet this romance came with extremity. The estate was endlessly expanded, altered, demolished, and rebuilt. In Hearst's world, there was no such thing as completion. Each finished section only pushed his ambition further. The castle ceased to be a residence and became proof that no boundary could restrain his will. The dream of building Hearst Castle thus carried a clear duality. On one hand, it was a pure creative impulse, a desire to leave beauty behind for the world. On the other, it reflected Hearst's deep fear of human finitude. If the power of journalism could fade with time, then stone, concrete, and art might endure longer, telling his story long after he himself was gone. From a remote ranch, San Simeon was transformed into a symbol of immortal ambition. And from this point on, the line between dream and obsession began to blur. Hearst Castle was not only built upon a hill, but constructed from the towering ego of the man who imagined it. When Hearst Castle reached its most complete phase, it no longer resembled a private American estate of the 20th century. Instead, it looked like a fragment of ancient Europe that had been misplaced, transported to the wrong time and the wrong geography. Amid the rugged hills of California, red Mediterranean roof tiles, bell towers inspired by Spanish cathedrals, and rows of Roman columns rose in quiet defiance, as if they did not belong there, yet existed with unwavering confidence. William Randolph Hearst did not build Hearst Castle to blend into America. He built it to rise above America. In Hearst's eyes, Europe represented historical depth and permanence, qualities a young nation like the United States still lacked. And if America did not possess thousands of years of history, he would buy it, dismantle it, transport it, and reassemble it for himself. More than 100 rooms were completed, each space a distinct aesthetic world. 5th, 10th, and 16th century carved wooden ceilings were brought intact from Spanish castles. Walls were densely hung with old paintings, hand-woven tapestries, and Renaissance maps. Floors were paved with Italian marble, cold, flawless, and reflective, casting light in a way that made anyone walking across them feel small. The two pools at Hearst Castle became symbols of excess beyond conventional standards. The Neptune Pool, framed by white marble colonnades, Greek statues, and deep blue water, felt more like an ancient temple than a place of leisure. The indoor Roman pool, clad entirely in millions of blue and gold glass mosaics, recreated the atmosphere of ancient Roman baths, where reflected light made the boundary between reality and myth nearly disappear. Every detail carried an unspoken message. This was not the home of a newspaper magnate, but the palace of a modern-day lord. Hearst made no attempt to hide this ambition. He arranged architecture as a declaration of power, a space where guests, politicians, financiers, and Hollywood stars alike were constantly reminded that they were entering Hearst's world, not their own. Yet within this overwhelming splendor, doubt began to seep in. Hearst Castle was breathtakingly beautiful, but also unsettlingly cold. The lavishly decorated rooms rarely conveyed the warmth of a true home. They felt more like exhibition halls than places meant for human life. The excess of art stripped each object of its individual story, turning cultural memory into an extension of personal power. Julia Morgan, who understood every stone of the structure, once acknowledged that Hearst Castle felt like a project without an endpoint. Hearst continually demanded changes, expansions, and upgrades, even when a space had already reached technical perfection. Luxury here was not merely material, it was psychological. A constant need for more, for bigger, for something ever more impressive. To the American public of the time, Hearst Castle was both a source of pride and a troubling question. It proved that America had become wealthy enough to possess the world's beauty. Yet it also exposed the vast gap between the elite and the rest of society, especially as the nation edged closer to economic instability. The architecture and extreme opulence of Hearst Castle therefore do more than inspire admiration. They force a deeper question. Is this art rescued from oblivion, or art stripped of its soul to serve the ego of a single man? And is this beauty truly enduring, or merely a dazzling facade concealing a far deeper unease beneath it? If the architecture of Hearst Castle was a declaration of power in stone and marble, then the life lived within it was the stage on which that power was performed night after night. As the sun set over the hills of San Simeon, the castle lit up like a mirage. Lights shimmered across the Neptune Pool. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed among ancient colonnades, and evening gowns glided through the cold corridors. This was the image Hearst wanted the world to see, not merely a newspaper tycoon, but a cultural patron, a man standing at the very center of America's elite. The regular guest list at Hearst Castle read like a miniature portrait of Hollywood's golden age. Charlie Chaplin with his half-playful, half-melancholic smile. Clark Gable exuding effortless masculinity. Greta Garbo, silent and inscrutable. Directors, screenwriters, politicians, and financiers sat at the same tables, beneath centuries-old European paintings, drinking imported wine and discussing power, art, and the future of America. These gatherings were governed by strict discipline, mirroring Hearst himself. Meals followed fixed schedules, seating was carefully arranged, and attire had to conform to unspoken rules. The atmosphere appeared relaxed, yet an invisible tension lingered, as if everyone understood they had entered Hearst's world and were expected to move to his rhythm. At the center of it all sat William Randolph Hearst, observing more than participating. He preferred to listen, to control the flow of conversation, to feel the weight of attention directed toward him. Yet it was precisely in these moments that his loneliness revealed itself. Surrounded by dozens of famous guests, Hearst remained apart, emotionally distant, as though power itself had erected an invisible wall around him. Marion Davies, the woman who shared Hearst's life for decades, was often the true spirit of these gatherings. She brought laughter, warmth, and tireless efforts to soften the atmosphere. But even her presence could not fill the deep void within Hearst. The castle could hold hundreds of people, yet his sense of isolation seemed to grow the more crowded it became. At night, when the guests withdrew to their lavishly decorated bedrooms, Hearst Castle returned to a heavy silence. Long corridors echoed with solitary footsteps. Rooms overflowing with art, no longer warmed by admiring gazes, became as cold as museums after closing hours. It was then that Hearst confronted himself, and the question no banquet could conceal, whether power and luxury truly provided the human connection he longed for. Life inside Hearst Castle was therefore a paradox. It was dazzling, vibrant, filled with laughter and light. Yet it also exposed the psychological cost of unrestrained ambition. The parties connected all of Hollywood, but they could not save one man from the isolation created by the very power he had built. In that glow of splendor, Hearst Castle was not merely a playground for the elite. It became a symbol of an era one in which fame and loneliness walked side by side, and the higher a person rose, the further they drifted from the simplest human connections. As Hearst Castle rose ever higher on the hills of California, another castle, an invisible one, was being built in parallel by William Randolph Hearst. This second fortress was far larger and far more influential than any architectural structure. It was his media empire, not made of stone or marble, but of newsprint, black ink, and sensational headlines powerful enough to shake the entire United States. At the beginning of the 20th century, American journalism did more than reflect society, it actively shaped it. Hearst understood this earlier than most. With dozens of newspapers, large and small, stretching from New York to San Francisco, he possessed a rare power, the ability to decide what the public would accept as truth and what would be buried in silence. Hearst's style of journalism was never cold or neutral. It was journalism driven by emotion, drama, and deliberate exaggeration. Crimes were portrayed as national tragedies. Political conflicts were framed as life-or-death battles. News was not merely meant to be read, but to provoke, to guide, to force readers to take sides. In Hearst's world, truth did not disappear, but it was bent, rearranged, and shaped to serve a higher goal: power. The most controversial peak of that power emerged during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Blazing headlines, furious illustrations, and stories told in tones bordering on calls to action filled his papers. Many historians later argued that Hearst Press played a significant role in inflaming public opinion and pushing the United States closer to war. While the exact extent of that influence remains debated, one fact is clear. A single individual, through media, had placed his hands on the steering wheel of history. It was here that ethical questions became impossible to ignore. When one person can influence millions of minds every day, where does responsibility lie? Hearst did not see himself as a manipulator. He believed he was serving the national interest, defending America, giving voice to the people. Yet the boundary between personal conviction and collective imposition is frighteningly thin. Within his press empire, power was exercised with discipline and little mercy. Reporters were expected to write along prescribed lines. Editors understood precisely which boundaries could not be crossed. Stories unfavorable to Hearst's views were often softened, obscured, or never published at all. Truth was not forbidden, but it was selectively chosen. And strikingly, Hearst himself gradually became a prisoner of the power he had created. Accustomed to bending public opinion, he increasingly believed in his own version of reality. Editorial decisions ceased to be merely business strategies. They became reflections of his vast ego. In Hearst's eyes, the world functioned best when it functioned according to his interpretation. The public of that era was both captivated by and dependent on Hearst newspapers. They read them to understand the world, yet unconsciously came to see the world through the lens he constructed. An unequal relationship took shape. On one side, millions searching for information. On the other, a single man determining the narrative voice of an age. In this context, Hearst Castle takes on a different meaning. It is not merely a symbol of wealth, but the material consequence of media power. Every statue, every painting, every lavish corridor was sustained by a system capable of shaping collective emotion. The castle stands there, silent, immense, and heavy, as a reminder that invisible power can be far more frightening than visible power. This part of the story offers no simple answers. Hearst was neither a pure villain nor merely a shrewd businessman. He was a product of an era in which media expanded faster than society's ethical capacity to restrain it. And for that very reason, the question of his responsibility continues to echo today. When truth can be bent, who will stand to keep it upright? No empire, whether built of stone or of power, can stand forever against the tremors of history. For William Randolph Hearst, that moment did not arrive with gunfire or public scandal, but in the cold silence of numbers. Numbers of debt, increasingly burdensome balance sheets, and a dream that had grown larger than the dreamer's ability to sustain it. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, swept across the United States like an unforgiving storm. Industries collapsed, banks failed, and the advertising market, the lifeblood of newspapers, nearly froze. For Hearst's media empire, which had expanded too rapidly and at enormous cost, this was a devastating blow. Revenues plunged while operating expenses remained immense. Newsrooms that had once buzzed with activity began laying off staff. Newspapers that had once dominated their markets were forced to shut down or be sold off. At the same time, Hearst Castle continued to consume money. A project that had never possessed a final, definitive master plan now became the clearest symbol of ambition spiraling beyond control. Every unfinished wall, every half-completed room, every ship carrying artworks from Europe to America added a new financial burden. Hearst, who had once believed wealth to be limitless, began to confront the harsh boundaries of reality. The decline did not unfold in a single dramatic moment. It was slow, prolonged, and painful. Banks tightened credit. Financial advisors warned him, then pressured him, and eventually forced Hearst to relinquish direct control over many of his assets. Negotiations took place quietly, in stark contrast to the era when his decisions had been unquestionable commands. During these years, Hearst gradually withdrew from public life. The castle, once the center of parties and power, became quieter than ever. Unfinished rooms were left abandoned. New expansion plans were crossed out and forgotten. Hearst Castle did not collapse, but it froze in place, like a structure trapped in time, mirroring the mental state of the man who had created it. For Hearst, this decline was not merely a financial failure. It was an assault on his identity. His entire life had been tied to the ideas of expansion, control, and victory. Being forced to acknowledge limits, to sell off assets, to accept that his dream would never be completed, was a deeply personal tragedy. Ambition, once his driving force, became a burden he could not cast aside. In this period, Hearst Castle took on a different kind of beauty. Stripped of its former splendor, it became somber, almost fragile. Long corridors led to doors that were never opened. Grand ideas left unfinished lingered silently as reminders of the cost of never knowing when to stop. The castle was not destroyed, but had lost its original purpose. No longer a symbol of boundless power, it became evidence of a dream that exceeded human limits. Hearst's decline was not loud, but it left a heavy echo. It raised enduring questions about the boundary between vision and obsession, between legacy and burden. When power and money are no longer enough to sustain a dream, what remains for the person who devoted an entire lifetime to it? As power gradually slipped away and the noise of the outside world grew quieter, William Randolph Hearst entered the final stage of his life in a space very different from the image he had once constructed for himself. No longer the media tycoon who shook the United States, no longer the master of endless lavish parties, Hearst now faced limits that could not be negotiated: his body, his memory, and time itself. His health declined markedly in the late 1940s. Chronic pain, cardiovascular problems, and neurological issues made Hearst increasingly dependent on others. The man who had once commanded thousands of employees, who had issued orders to an entire press empire, was now forced to accept a slower rhythm of life, governed by medical schedules and constant care. During this period, Hearst rarely appeared in public. He retreated into more private spaces, spending most of his time in smaller residences, far removed from Hearst Castle. The castle on the hills of San Simeon, once a monument to his towering ego, had become a heavy memory. He knew he would never see it completed as he had imagined. A grand dream, left unfinished forever. Those close to him recalled that Hearst in his final years grew quieter, less outwardly confident than the man he had once been. In place of absolute certainty came long silences and thoughts difficult to name. Not public remorse, but a kind of spiritual exhaustion. As if, after a lifetime spent pursuing power and influence, he began to wonder whether any of it had truly delivered the immortality he had once sought. Hearst's greatest fear was no longer the loss of money or power, but the fear of being forgotten. In a media world that never stops moving, where today's headlines are quickly replaced, he understood better than anyone the cruelty of time. The man who had once controlled the narrative of an entire era now worried about how his own story would be told. As a builder of modern America, or a symbol of manipulation, as a patron of the arts, or a man consumed by power. His relationship with Marion Davies in these final years took on a different tone. Gone were the Hollywood glamour and the roaring parties. What remained was care, devotion, and quiet understanding. She stayed by his side not for fame or influence, but for a bond that had outgrown its original ambitions. In Hearst's physical decline, his human side, fragile, ordinary, and deeply real, emerged more clearly than ever. Hearst's final years were not a dramatic collapse, but a silent withdrawal. He lived long enough to see the world change, to see his empire no longer at its peak, to understand that power, no matter how great, cannot freeze time. And in that stillness, Hearst became someone else. Less a legend, more a man. Less certainty, more reflection. This part of the story is not meant to judge, but to see Hearst as a whole human being. A man who built monumental structures, yet could not build peace for himself. A man who left a profound mark on American history, yet carried within him a deeply human fear. That when everything ends, would anyone remember him, not only as a symbol of power, but as someone who lived, dreamed, and paid the price for both. After William Randolph Hearst passed away in 1951, Hearst Castle did not close like a chapter neatly finished. Instead, it opened into a question that would linger for generations. The castle still stands on the hills overlooking the Pacific Ocean, silent, monumental, as if waiting for history to pass judgment. With no owner, no lavish parties, and no personal ambition guiding every stone, Hearst Castle entered a new role, that of memory. In the years following Hearst's death, his family faced an unavoidable reality. Maintaining such an enormous estate was nearly impossible. Eventually, Hearst Castle was transferred to the state of California and became a historic landmark open to the public. The decision was deeply symbolic. A personal dream, once built to affirm the power of a single man, became a shared inheritance, one that millions could walk through, observe, and interpret for themselves. For many visitors, Hearst Castle is a masterpiece. Its overwhelming architecture, rare European artworks, and sweeping views of the California landscape inspire awe. It represents a moment in American history when the nation sought to prove it could rival, surpass the ancient civilizations of Europe. From this perspective, Hearst Castle stands as a symbol of creative ambition, upward striving, and the belief that individual can produce greatness. For others, however, the castle carries a different meaning. It is evidence of the imbalance between ambition and limitation, between power and responsibility. Every lavish room is also a reminder of the price that was paid, not only in money, but in isolation, obsession, and the psychological fractures of the man behind it. Seen this way, Hearst Castle is not merely architecture, but a warning carved in stone about what happens when ambition no longer knows how to stop. The legacy of William Randolph Hearst is similarly two-sided. He revolutionized American journalism, expanded the reach of mass media, and left a lasting imprint on how information is produced and consumed. Yet he remains a controversial figure, inseparable from ethical questions about media power, about who gets to shape truth, and for what purpose. Hearst Castle thus becomes a meeting point of these contradictions. It does not force visitors to admire or condemn. Instead, it invites reflection. As one walks through its long corridors, gazes down at the still waters of Neptune Pool, or stands before ancient statues transported across half the globe, one is not merely admiring beauty. One is confronting a question about oneself. If granted power, wealth, and absolute freedom, what would we build and what would it cost? As the film comes to an end, Hearst Castle is no longer just a historical setting. It becomes a mirror, one that reflects humanity's drive to rise, but also the fragility of dreams that grow too large. William Randolph Hearst spent his life resisting the fear of being forgotten. And paradoxically, It is this never-completed castle that ensures he is remembered, not only as a powerful tycoon, but as a human being who wagered his entire life on ambition and left behind a question that history will never answer in just one way.